restorative justice program, and I'm so happy to have the people who are central parts of the program here today to talk to us. So I'm going to actually let them introduce themselves really briefly. I just want to say a bit about this program, which was really the brainchild of Judge Sorokin, and it really is a way of rethinking our system of mass incarceration in the way that DA Rachel Rollins was talking about in her speech this morning, with this idea that continually sending people to prison, particularly the kinds of people who go through this program, is not effective, and that if they have a chance to participate in a lot of therapy-based rehabilitative services, including restorative justice as a key component, they'll gain a lot of insight into what is causing them to commit crimes and also reckon with the harms that they have caused. And I got so interested in this program that I wrote about it and spent a lot of time with the people here, and I'm so grateful that they came all the way from Boston. So I want to make sure that they have as much time as possible. We're going to do a lot of question, answer, back and forth, and also we want to involve folks in the room. So I just want to start by asking if people in the room are familiar with this idea of restorative justice. How many people have familiarity with it?
Great.
Okay, and how many people have ever taken part in any kind of a restorative justice process? Wow. Okay, this is a very well-informed room.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Judge Sorokin to begin with, just to introduce himself, introduce the program, and then we're just going to go down the line so you get to know everyone who's here today.
Do you want me to give a little overview of what the two minutes of the program? So my name is Leo Sorokin. I'm a United States District Judge in Boston. We have a program at the court in Boston called RISE. In summary form, what RISE is this. If you are any person who is charged with a crime in federal court in Boston who is released on conditions as opposed to detained in jail, anybody who's released is advised about this program, no matter what they're charged with. And then it's up to that person to decide if he or she wants to apply. If you want to apply to be in the program, there's no essays or anything like that, no SAT tests. You basically just say you're interested. And then a committee consisting of a representative of the U.S. Attorney's Office, the federal public defender, probation, and a couple of judges reviews your case. And people can, the rough criteria for admission is either you have a serious drug problem or you have serious deficiencies in education, family background, employment, life skills that was such that you would benefit from a structured pretrial program. And then the ultimate decision whether you get in or not is up to the judge whose case you're assigned to. But we found that we've been doing this, 5 years? Mm-hmm. In 5 years, I think we've had a pretty much consensus. Nobody's ever gone into the program on recommendation of the committee without a consensus, and none of the judges have ever disregarded the recommendation. If you get into the program, there's a couple things to know. One, there's a lot of therapeutic services, like Laura said, drug treatment, parenting skills, depending on what's appropriate for you. The second part, this was a critical component to me, and I insist, I put this in as a requirement. You have to participate in restorative justice. You can't, if you don't want to be in the program, you don't want to do restorative justice, that's fine, then don't be in the program. It's a voluntary program. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but the program is a 1-year delay in your sentencing. No promise. The only promise we give is the specific promise of what people are entitled to under the Constitution, which is every fact that relates to you or your case will be considered by the judge at sentencing. Jay.
So, as you know, I've done a lot of work on diversionary restorative justice. The big issue that's raised when I hear you speak is I was not aware that this was a condition of release program. So is this, because if it's pre-adjudicatory, do you have an MOU insulating statements?
So here's what we do about that. It's a great clarifying question. We actually, part of coming into the program, if you want to be in the program, is you only can join RISE if you plead guilty. So, and originally when we did it, that's in part how we addressed that problem. And so you have to plead guilty early. We originally had a 90-day rule, but it didn't make sense, the 90-day rule. And we're not like the Eastern District of Virginia. We're not a rocket docket. And so it's more flexible. What we look at for that is that you're someone who's accepting responsibility for what you did, but you're not in it until you plead. You don't get succeeding in the program doesn't guarantee you any particular benefit. All we promise you is whatever happened will be considered. The RJ piece will be explained in more detail, but the gist of it, part of it is required, which I know can be an issue for some people in the RJ world. But what we require is merely listening and presence. And then the affirmative acts that you might do are not required. Those are the later stages of the program, and those are voluntary. And what we found is people are into it. So that's in a nutshell what the RISE program is. We've been doing it 5 years. It's great. We've presented on it to the Magistrate Judge Conference. We're presenting on it next year at the National District Judges Convention. We've received a lot of positive enthusiasm. The courts that have come to observe it and the people who've come to look at it have really been interested. And I'd say, since so many of you know something about it, the biggest issue is that people think they know what it is without knowing anything about it. And that's the biggest problem we have. They've decided they know what it is without ever reading about it, learning about it, knowing it, or going. Once they do, and what I would say to you that, and then I'll be quiet for a moment, is it's values-based. It's like, I think that restorative justice is one of the most transformative things in the criminal justice system because it changes the discussion from merely more or less, which is basically the discussion I think, at least in federal court, we've been having post-Booker and pre-Booker for at least 20 years into a very different, more holistic, value-based discussion, and it's a better discussion. So that's why I'm really enthused about it, and I see expansion possibilities.
We're just introducing or going into our presentation.
And do a little bit about your role in the program.
Hi, so thanks for having me. My name is Maria Dediaco. I'm a federal probation officer in the District of Massachusetts. I've been a federal probation officer for about 10 years now. And before that, I worked for the Department of Children and Families, sort of the social service agency in Massachusetts, and for several years. And that's really where I was introduced to restorative justice through an agency called ROCA, which is based in Chelsea, a real inner city sort of location with a really diverse population and diverse issues. And what I'll say is that by far, in all of my public service, I'm so convinced that really restorative justice is the way that we should be moving towards. It is by far the most meaningful and transformational change in folks that I have seen, more than any other treatment or program or diversion. And the work that's done with restorative justice, when it's done well, really does have long-lasting impacts, not only on the responsible parties, but also the victims, the community, the court family folks who participate. So I was sort of in the right place at the right time, and thanks to Judge Sorokin, who really opened the doors, we were able to develop a program that sits right now in the inside of the RISE program. But I believe that our restorative justice program can be sort of picked up and applied in lots of different ways. So I look forward to telling you more about it, and I'll turn over to Jamie to introduce himself.
I should just say on that we are consciously trying to develop, for among other things, a manual about how, essentially, I'm really just like an offensive lineman in a football game. All I did was help open up a hole, and after that, Maria did everything. She's the one who's scoring the touchdown and deserves the credit. But Maria's putting together a manual, sort of how we've done this in detail, so that the various parts you'll hear about later will be something that, to the extent you're in the federal system and you want to do something very similar, you could just hopefully literally replicate. And to the extent you're somewhere else, you could take it and borrow from it.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Herbert. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney in Boston. Thanks to Lara for inviting me for this. I've been with our office for almost 30 years now in a variety of capacities. I got involved in this because Judge Sorokin, when he was designing this RISE program, he was talking to people from our office, and he said he wanted restorative justice to be a part of it. And I had read a book by Howard Zara called Changing Lenses, which I recommend to everyone if you haven't already read it. So I told him I was interested in that, and an hour and a half later, we got done talking about restorative justice for that part. And he connected me with somebody who was doing restorative justice work in Massachusetts prisons, which is something that Maria and I have both taken part in. And now my role in RISE is really to be an understudy to Maria. We're trying to expand the program, and Maria's been doing everything herself in terms of coordinating and facilitating each of the restorative justice programs or tracks, and she needs help. So I raised my hand, and another AUSA did as well. And so now I'm learning to do what she does to some extent under her close supervision. But I would totally echo what Maria said. She's an absolute star at restorative justice. It is completely transformative. I have never seen anything like it. If you want to know from a prosecutor's standpoint, does it work? It does. You'll hear directly from Laura. And this is as good an example as you can get, because in my job, I never would have encountered somebody like Laura in this way. And walked in today and saw her, and we're like, old friends. So it's an amazing process. So I'm glad you all are here to hear about it.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lara Santana, and I was one of first three participants in the RISE program. I was the first graduating participant, and I was part of the first restorative justice workshop that was required for the RISE program.
So I am actually going to follow up, Laura, with you first, if you wouldn't mind, because restorative justice is one of those things that we say it's really transformative, but I think it's helpful to actually hear the story of someone who went through the process. And if you wouldn't mind sharing your story and how you came to be in the program and what the restorative justice component of the program meant to you personally.
About 5 years ago, I trafficked drugs into Boston Logan Airport from Dominican Republic, and I was caught by customs. I was facing many, many years in prison, and I just happened to get the right person. My lawyer was Jennifer Pucci, who was doing a lot of work with the RISE program, and recommended me for the program. What was the other?
And so when you first started, did you know what restorative justice was, or did you have any concept of what it was going to be like for you?
I had no idea what restorative justice was. I went into it, feeling I'm guilty and that's it, and going through, court dates and feeling like, everyone was against me pretty much, until I got into this RISE program, and I realized that people were willing to help you and to help you change, and the restorative justice part of it was very, I think the most important part of this whole thing. The workshop was amazing. It was only 2 days. It should be longer, but we always say this, and we were handed the tools to look at our crimes differently and to not feel as guilty as we did. And sorry, I'm a little nervous. So I think with everything if you want to see someone that's a living proof of what RJ and RISE program, it's me. I changed so much, and it was really, really powerful to be part of both the RISE program, the restorative justice part of the workshop, and it was amazing. It was really good.
And I don't know, Maria, maybe could you talk a little bit about what happens in the workshop? And I know that Judge Sorokin has been in the workshop, and I know Jamie participates regularly, but just sort of what that actually looks like in there.
Yeah. And so what I'll say to start is that we developed this in mind for our particular court, and I do think that we can replicate it and pick it up. But I think that there are certain nuances that can be changed and that can make it fit in different places. So right now our program has 4 parts. The first 2 are required, and required I sort of quote because you do have to volunteer to participate in the program, so you're fully aware of the restorative justice requirement beforehand. And the second 2 parts are voluntary. The first part is an informational session with the restorative justice coordinator. We're meeting with defendants and basically giving them, we're planting seeds. We're giving them an overview of what the program is. We're explaining to them the options that they have to participate in. And the key things that we like to emphasize are we're starting to shift the idea of crime as just breaking the law. We're starting to talk about crime as harm, and who is impacted by that harm. In our court, most of the cases are considered victimless crime. Gun trafficking, drug trafficking. Despite knowing that gun and drug trafficking have victims, in our court, they're viewed as victimless. So it's really having folks look at the big picture and think about, who is impacted by the actions that I'm taking. We're also planting the seeds about thinking about making amends. And this idea of meaningful acceptance of responsibility, not just pleading guilty, not just saying I did it or following what the attorney told you to do just because it's a better deal, but really we're asking folks to take a deep look into what they feel is they're responsible for. What is the harm that they've caused? It's also an opportunity for us to assess the defendants and figure out what their needs are so that we can better help them through the process. The next part that's required is a 2-day workshop. It's a full 2 days, and we involve...
Like 9 to 4.
Yeah. And it's defendants, community members. So we have victims and surrogate victims. We use folks in the community who have been impacted by harm. Mothers who've lost children to gun violence, parents who've lost children to overdoses, people who've been harmed directly by crime. And there's also individuals such as, we have attorneys and other professional sort of mental health folks, or really depending on what the defendant's needs are. The group is about 20, and that's the largest that the group can really go. And we try to sort of have half defendants and half sort of other folks. And it's really intense. We are talking about values. If anyone's been in a circle, it's really modeled as a traditional circle. So we go through the full 2 days that way. We're doing introductions, we're doing trust building, we're talking about values, we're unpacking harm, and we're creating spaces within this federal system to have conversations in a very different way. And what we find I'd have to say 98% of the time is that people walk into that room and say, this is great, but my crime has no victims. And by the end, they're like, oh shit, I can't believe how many people I could have possibly impacted. And that happens each and every time without me telling them to say that. And that's the beauty of restorative justice, is that we're not telling people your crime has victims. We're not telling people that what you did was wrong. We're just creating the space and having them engage with people differently so that they can come to that on their own. Frankly, the research is really clear that if judges, no offense, tell people what to do, that might be helpful for lots of different reasons, but
Not that many of them are sitting in the front.
Yeah. But the idea of really involving the individual and having them be a key member of that decision of deciding what's going to happen, that is way more impactful in the long term. And that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to this idea of making changes, not just today, 2 years, 3 years. We're trying to get folks to shift. The next two parts are voluntary, and I'll say that about 85% of folks that go through the 2-day workshop volunteer to do more, which is crazy. I mean, we've got them doing so much stuff already. They're on federal supervision. They're usually under intense supervision. They've got a long list of stuff to do, and they're volunteering to do more. It's probably one of the only programs that we have that folks are actually choosing to participate in and not being told to participate in. The third step is sort of individual work, and that looks very different for each person. It may be readings and reflections. It may be doing watching some videos and writing reflections, but that's a sort of a preparatory phase to prepare for the fourth step, which is an individual restorative meeting. We have created individual restorative meetings, so either circles or restorative conferences with defendants and victims or surrogate victims. And we use the word victim loosely. We've done them with individuals and their children, Really think about that. Like having a long-term drug trafficker apologize and accept responsibility to their teenage child. Like that impact that has, not even thinking about the defendant, but really on that child, it makes a huge difference. We've done them with surrogate victims. We've put folks that are responsible for putting illegal guns on the street together with moms who've lost children to gun violence. We've done them with defendants and cops. We've done them in a variety of different settings. And what I already said this before, but really the hope of this is that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, when folks are faced with difficult decisions again, they're not going to remember the judge or the attorney or maybe the probation officer, but the idea is that they remember this really transformational experience, that they sat across from someone, accepted responsibility, and made promises so that they'll make different decisions. That's
So,
quick
Judge,
overview.
I was wondering on that point, sort of at the back end, if you might tell the story that we were talking about on the phone of John Paul.
Yes. So there's a guy who was arrested for drug distribution in federal court, and he had was a pretty profile I've seen many times before. He dropped out of school in high school. He had a serious drug problem by his early 20s with opiates and cocaine, crack. He had a record that was of arrests that was very long and a fair number of convictions. Some were pure drug addict crimes like possession of drugs, shoplifting. Some were more serious crimes like a fair number of burglaries and breaking and entering into people's homes, sometimes at night, sometimes when people were there. But so he got into the RISE program and he came before me. I was his judge for sentencing. And so he had a letter in his package that was from his mother-in-law. I've never seen actually a letter from a defendant's mother-in-law before, at least not one supporting the defendant. And so what she said was this. She said, John's been dating my daughter for about 5 years, and I didn't like it when he dated her because he was a criminal and he was a drug addict and he was drawing her into the life of drugs, and she became a drug addict. And you can understand why that woman didn't like John. She had a lot of really good reasons. And she said, but I want you to know now, today, I'm cautiously optimistic. She said, it's cautious, but he's behaving differently. He's not just sober, but he's behaving differently. And so it really struck me because I'd never seen a letter like that before. And I'm going to read you just one line of what he said to me at his sentencing. And he said, he talked about like what the program was helped him in different ways, right? But then he said this. He said, in the experience that I had there in the Restorative Justice Conference, that 2-day circle, is almost like an aha moment for me. Like now I realize the impact that it makes on people's lives. And so that was his aha moment. And so I said to him, after I sentenced him to probation, I said to him, you have to write me a letter. I'm ordering you to write me a letter each year on the anniversary of your sentencing, and you tell me how you're doing because you've done really well. I want to know how you're doing in a year, in 2 and 3 years now, because how you do is going to matter for your girlfriend, to your mother-in-law, to your children, to your neighbors, to those people's houses you haven't yet burglarized. And, like if you do well, you won't be going into their houses, and that would be a good thing. And I want to know how you're doing. So he wrote me a letter. I just got it a couple of weeks ago. And he's doing better than he was doing at his sentencing. He's and his girlfriend are both sober. They're buying a house. And he told me that his mother-in-law now hugs him and tells him that she loves him. And I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive transformation. And I think that he's not the only person who has said to me really what Laura said. It's like he's saying the same thing. Laura was saying that, when she was in that, the thing that changed was what was in that circle. And yes, go ahead.
So this may be a question that I assume you're going to get to, but I can't help it. Data collection. Do you have numbers, yet about how many people have gone through the program, any recidivism data?
So we're, yes and no. We have, and maybe you can add to it. I know we are collecting numbers. We keep track of the number of people who apply to get in, the number who recommended to get in, who get in, who finish it, how many get kicked out, what happens to them afterwards. The two things that I can tell you, there are a few, but not many, who get kicked out. Really means instead of waiting a year, we have your sentencing earlier because you violated conditions and your release was revoked, or you just decide, I don't want to do this. The recidivism rates we haven't tracked, we're keeping track of, but we started 5 years ago. Most people will be on supervision for at least 3 years. We don't have a lot of data. Like Laura, who's one of our first, she finishes her federal supervision in the end of the month, day before Thanksgiving.
The day
right?
before Thanksgiving.
Right. So we don't have a lot of people who are beyond that.
Yeah.
But she's done great on supervision. What's your sense, Maria, of how people have done?
I think overall, so we've had about, I want to say upwards, and we have the numbers, I'm happy to send them to you. So we've had upwards of 60 people go through the program. So that's sort of where I can tell you this 85% who have gone through the program. They've all done the intro session. They've all done the 2-day workshop, that choose to volunteer to do more. So that's one sort of data point that I think is really valuable. As Judge Sorokin said, we are collecting the data, but we haven't done much, to be honest, with analyzing it or tracking it, just because the program is newer. So really looking at those long-term outcomes. And Jamie and I have talked about this a lot before, but we're hopefully going to figure out ways not just to include recidivism, but also look at trying to quantify the impact that this really has. Because I think recidivism is important, but there are lots of other meaningful changes that occur because of the program that we really need to learn how to capture and value better.
So we met with some people from people in the Harvard statistics program, and one of the things they said to us is, you can't do a statistical study that's meaningful because your numbers are too little. Like, they basically said no. And so we are tracking it, but one of the things we've struggled with is how to figure out how to, like, take John. One of the things that's a huge outcome is he hasn't been arrested or anything like that. So the recidivism, that's an important piece. But a really significant thing is there are 2 kids that he and his girlfriend had they were barred from seeing because they were drug addicts, and the state courts, the probate court or what have you, had taken custody away. And now those 2 kids are back in their life, and they're doing well, and they're responsible role models. They have jobs. And so that's a really significant thing, I think, that's accomplished by this that shouldn't be lost, and by the mere fact that it's hard to track it. And so we haven't figured out how to capture that, and it is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I know they are too, just sort of how do we look at that? But that's part of the equation.
So Jamie, I wanted to ask you, you've been a prosecutor, as you said, for 30 years, and I'm curious to know how you see restorative justice as fitting in with your overall mission as a prosecutor to do justice. And then the second part of my question is, do you see a universe where this kind of program can be applied to people who committed acts of violence? That it's more, these crimes are very serious, but as Maria was saying, are stereotypically thought of as victimless, but a crime where there is clearly a direct victim and there is violence involved.
Yeah, so to take the second one first, definitely it is being used in crimes of violence. The first thing that hooked me on this was sitting in on a session of something that's called the Victim Offender Education Group, which is a 34-week program at MCI Norfolk Prison. And it's generally just a program with some outside facilitators and inside guys. And the one I sat in on was the last or second to last of these sessions where they brought in some surrogate victims to encounter the guys in the group. And everybody in the group, I think there's 19 of them, everybody was in for murder of some kind. And they brought in some people named Kim and Ron Odom, whose son Stephen was murdered when he was 14 years old in a mistaken identity gang murder in Boston. And they brought in somebody else who was a journalist whose best friend had been murdered. But you had guys in this group, so a couple of them were giving their crime impact statement. in the kind of detail that prosecutors rarely hear from even in their best cooperators. I mean, you're talking about real acceptance of responsibility, very detailed account of what they did. And then Kim and Ron would talk about, or did talk about, the impact that the murder of their son had had on them and their family. And by the end of this group, you had one of these guys, you know, who's doing life without, in tears, saying to them, "I know it wasn't your son that I murdered, but I feel like it was, and I want to apologize to you." It just an amazing moment, and I just drove away from that prison that afternoon in a daze, you know, not really knowing what had happened, but knowing it was life altering. And so there is no doubt that it can be used for any type of crime, you know, and it is being used effectively from school discipline to murder. In terms of how I see it from a prosecutor standpoint, I think the initial hooks from somebody with a traditional prosecutor's mindset are it's victim-based. So it really arose out of, I think, an interest in getting victims more of what they need. And they're not getting it from the traditional criminal justice system. And I think anybody who's been doing that for a long time knows that we haven't been serving their needs and interests. Yeah, and there's a...
I'll let you finish your comment.
Yeah.
But I have
Okay. All right. And then the other is trying to get to a point of meaningful acceptance of responsibility, which is also something that we know that the adversarial system does not place a priority on. So I think but in terms of my evolution and how I see it, so those are the initial hooks. But then when you've been doing this for a while, it broadens your perspective of what justice is. And the retributive justice model is so ingrained in us that it does take a little while to get past that and until you see justice as a type of healing. And, you know, this group that Maria and I have worked with had a motto that I'm sure a number of others of you have heard of in similar groups that, you know, hurt people hurt people. And that's kind of, it's simple, but that really is the case. And, you know, the second part was healed people heal people. But restorative justice is trying to get to a place of healing, and it's viewing justice as something where people can get that type of healing, and so it's justice in a much broader sense that our traditional system can't get to. So I feel like it fits in perfectly, and it takes us to another level. And it's used in some places like New Zealand's juvenile justice system as the system, but it's more likely to be used as an adjunct to the system here. But it can be done in any number of ways.
Judge Donovan, I know you wanted to ask your question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, right.
And the last couple of points that you made really brought up what I wanted to say, because I think that in the traditional criminal justice model, we focus on the punishment side and really almost the dehumanization of the offender. And we ignore the fact that that person is going to go back into the community with their humanity basically severely reduced, and they're going to be hurt themselves and hurting, and as you said, hurting people, hurt other people. So I think that this program not only allows people to get back in touch and embrace their own humanity, but also engage in this healing process. And it's just amazing. I went through one of the programs, when I was a criminal court judge. I was a surrogate that I just went in just to learn. And I had some kind of story that I was, sharing. I pretended to be a shoplifter. And I had some kind of story I was giving to these folks, and they were pretty insistent. They did not want to hear any of my excuses. It really kind of scared me how much they rejected my unwillingness to accept responsibility for the wrongness that I was purportedly had created. But it can be really amazing to be in that circle that you talked about and hear it. And hear people rebutting those things that people throw out there as excuses for conduct.
That's absolutely right. But to your first point, that's no doubt about it. I mean, that crime comes out of from the moment of arrest. It's one act of dehumanization after another. Being incarcerated is at the end of it, when they're ready to be released, we say, go be human. And it's hard.
I want.
You had a question?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I just want to follow up what you said. It's exciting to be here today, to hear this. Because we often heard that someone, they hard work. And the justice system is like 10% of you do wrong should be punished. But now we come to the stage that we're going to awake their own conscience. So eventually we solve this problem, which is wonderful. And I'm just wondering if you also bring this idea to the legislative branch so that both of you can work together in terms of the funding and in terms of the lawmaking to make it eventually make the reform of the entire concept of legal system.
That's a great idea. And certainly if the legislative branch wanted to give us more money and devote more resources to this. I mean, I was talking to somebody who runs a juvenile justice program here in DC, and she had a very great insight sort of apropos of that, where she said, we have, I think she said 8, this is for juvenile court cases in DC. We have 12 prosecutors who prosecute cases, and we have 8 juvenile court restorative justice facilitators to run alternative restorative justice pathways for them. And she said, really, it should be about, it's wrong. It should be 12 to 15 of the facilitators and 5 or 6 of the prosecutors, because most of the cases plead. And we have the trial system is well suited for trials, but most of the people, the question isn't about guilt. And the sentencing process, the trial approach is ill-fitted for that. And this is a much better approach for sort of accountability, responsibility, sentencing, all those values. So in a sense, it would be, if the legislature thought of that and shifted its sort of funding priorities, I'm not sure how your boss would feel about it, Jamie, but shifted the focus and have more people who do RJ programs like Maria, and so that we thought of the process, that'd be a great thing. But in the meantime, they haven't called me yet, so.
Yeah, another thing is that maybe if we're able to change the law and give those who have been reformed or awakened, give them a chance so that they can turn around and become someone who can share that experience and knowledge.
I think that's a fair point, but I do think that, I think it's true that certainly changes in law could make a difference, but I think there are many things, everything we did here, it required no change in rule, no change in law. It's fully consistent with the United States Constitution, with every provision of the United States Code, with the federal rules of criminal procedure, and there are many other things. So there's many things people can do without waiting for Congress or the state legislature in your jurisdiction to change the law. But
I will say, though, one thing that I think makes me feel hopeful about the changes in the law is that I think the more that programs like RISE are adopted and succeed and they become part of these winning platforms that, for example, this wave of progressive prosecutors are running on, and the more there's a track record, the more I think legislatures would very much be open to requiring or changing the law. So there's one state that has restorative justice codified, maybe not surprisingly, Vermont, and they do a whole lot of restorative justice. And I think that that one state is certainly a model for, they have their own legislation. But I think part of it too is just getting people familiar with the concept, comfortable with the concept on the prosecution side. On the defense side, there's no public defender here, so I feel compelled to speak for us and say, I think it's just as educational for public defenders, because we, at least me, I was sort of trained to not think about the victim, ignore the victim, or only think about the victim as someone who needed to be sort of cross-examined or discredited in an adversarial process. And for me, learning about restorative justice and seeing it from the victim's point of view was really transformative. And you know, we get locked into these roles that are very adversarial and narrowing in terms of what they do to our thought process. And I think for people who are repeat players in the system to embrace this and embrace a different idea of being an advocate and kind of having a 360-degree view, that it offers it for the people who are, as Maria was saying, part of the court family, which is not to say we're the most important people, but it is really interesting that there's an openness on both sides of the adversarial system to thinking about doing things differently. And I feel like that's an implicit acknowledgement of failures to serve victims and failures to serve defendants.
It's one reason I think it's transformative is that when you start thinking about these issues from a restorative justice perspective, it's not really a pro-prosecutor perspective. or an anti-prosecutor perspective. It's not really a pro-defense attorney or defendant perspective or anti. And if you think about it from very traditional tactical roles, it offers something, it's sort of a cost benefit to both sides. But if you think about it from a societal and human perspective, it's way better.
And I did want to just ask Laura one question, then I wanted to open it up. And also we have this testimonial that we want to play for you, and we're hoping that the audio is good enough, but it's from another RISE graduate named Bobby Fitzpatrick. And after Laura answers my question, I hope we can maybe do that and then open it up. But Laura, I wanted to ask you about your experience in the circle process. And we've been talking about how harm people, and it's not as if you sort of got this idea one day to traffic drugs for fun. It came out of a whole series of life experiences and family tragedy, and I'm just wondering, to the extent that you feel comfortable, that you could share about that and sort of how that came up in the circle and what was helpful about that for you.
It's true. Harmed people want to harm people. In this case, I wanted to harm myself, and I was just very self-destructive. I went into the circle not knowing what to expect, because you don't know. And you sit there and you're like, oh my God, I have to do this, but you don't realize how much it's going to impact you to hear everybody's story, to participate in all these activities, and to actually tell your story and be heard, not judged. And as Maria said, there's no victimless crime. Your family is a victim. They go through all these things with you. And I never realized that. I did what I did and never even cared. I mean, I wanted to harm myself and I wanted to be self-destructive, but I never looked at how this could impact my family. I never did. I went and I'm like, okay, but we did so many activities. We cried, we laughed, and it was everybody has so much respect for each other. We came up with rules, and at the end of it, it was like, wow, we want to be here for another 2 weeks, not 2 days. You know, we're like, this is too short. But we definitely, I think everybody that walked in there with their mindset where they were obligated, they felt like, this is helpful. And I was one of them. I came out of there so light. I had like this, I don't know, I looked at things different. The sun, looked brighter that day. And it was, until this day, it was, I think about it all the time. And I have this rock, which is a talking piece that Maria gave to me. And it says aspire. And I'm like, I look at that and I'm like, yes. And I am here. And I'm like, wow, I want to make sure that everybody knows that this program did work, and the restorative justice part was so important. And you don't know until if you guys have never participated in a circle, it's really intense. So bring tissues and know that you're gonna cry. You're going to be crying, and it's just a life-changing experience.
I just want to jump in and say, because what you're saying is so moving, because I didn't really understand circles until I sat in a circle. So, came from a traditional public defender due process, then I'm a judge, and I didn't get it. People kept telling me about how great it was until I actually sat in a circle, and you have to listen to each other. It creates such empathy, such community, that it's a very, very powerful experience. And hearing you talk, I'm flashing back to like the first circle I sat in, and I thought it really was transformational. You feel part of a community, and I think that's important. It made me as a judge much less judgmental, better listening.
It's powerful.
Very powerful.
Judge Burnett, I was appointed a magistrate judge back in 1969 in the federal court here in D.C., and the federal district judges delegated one of the functions to magistrates was to deal with technical probation violations. And I had a gentleman who had been in and out of jail about 6 times for heroin convictions that Judge Gash referred to me. And there were instances that it appeared the probation officer just wanted to get rid of him because he didn't maintain a residence, he was homeless, and so forth. I reviewed the case, threatened is referred to Judge Gash holding the mayor and the government agencies in contempt for not providing him the services he needed. They did so with me holding a number of review hearings, and then about 6 or 7 years ago, I run into this gentleman and I said, "You look vaguely familiar." He said, "Yes, I'm the guy who had been in jail 6 times for heroin violations. I've been drug-free now for 31 years, and I'm now working for the District of Columbia government as a counselor to break up youth gangs and drug violations to keep kids from making the mistakes I made." So the magistrate system and the federal court system, with reference to technical violations, were in fact used to, almost like warrant for family law, review hearings as to whether the agencies were doing what they were supposed to do. And this guy, out of the clear blue sky, was about 30 pounds and looked like an athlete, or in his early 60s at that point. But now he was saving the city from youth gangs and violence in the nation's capital. And I just thought I'd point that out as one of the roles U.S. magistrates, now called magistrate judges, have performed for the entire judicial system in the whole area of probation revocation. And I have adopted that in 32 years I served on the bench and used that technique. And I can't think of one case where I've had to revoke probation, where the restorative justice techniques have worked, and sometimes people have come more committed, almost like ministers or preachers, and work with youth. And I have a couple that I'm working with right now in D.C. who have started nonprofits to keep kids out of trouble and making the mistakes they made.
That's great.
Ron?
So I have a question for Jamie. I think all of this is great. So this is how does this intersect with the normal thing that you do with people you have under your thumb to provide information, testify, go out and do sort of work that you would ordinarily have to do?
So it's a really good question. I was just wondering about that recently.
Actually, a great question.
It was a great question. I stand corrected. I was just wondering about that recently. Could it have an application in terms of cooperators? I mean, in a sense, we spend so much of our time trying to, prove things, and in some cases getting people who were involved in it to admit everything that they were doing and other people were doing. It's a very frustrating process, and people aren't usually willing to do that initially. And when you eventually get a cooperator who, spills their guts about what they've been doing, that's a little bit like what this feels like to sit in a restorative justice circle and have somebody really take responsibility. And so, I wondered, is this a path for, cooperators? And I'm not sure. I think there's some issues with that. I think if this were to start, one of the great things about this RISE program is there's no guarantee to it. And so there's this aspect of personal accountability, and, you get what you get out of it, and it's up to you to be able to describe what you got out of it. And I have a little bit of a fear, and this may not be going to what your question was at all, but I have a little bit of fear that if we're used in a cooperation situation, it would become sort of like, just another currency that's given out. We're giving a benefit to cooperators by letting them participate in this, and I wouldn't really want it to be seen that way. And the other thing is, restorative circles are really based on principles of confidentiality. I can see putting somebody up on the stand.
Give up the normal information that you might otherwise get to allow the person to go into the program and become a better person later, as opposed to helping you continue the traditional law enforcement.
I personally would.
I'm not sure that the choice has been joined that often. I think the reality is probably that a lot of the people who are getting out aren't people who the government is necessarily really seeking, who are getting into this program, necessarily seeking a lot of cooperation from. So I think that, I think it's an issue, and I'm sure if it hasn't arisen, it will arise, that the government would have to make that choice. I agree with Jamie that it probably wouldn't be a good fit generally for someone to be both cooperating and being in this. Do you want to play the?
Should we try? So in my imagining of this, there was a screen and you guys would be watching Bobby Fitzpatrick. In reality, you are going to be squinting at Maria's computer and listening to Bobby Fitzpatrick. Maria, I don't know if you need to do any setup before you play it.
No, the only thing that I would say is that this is another participant. He actually was in the same sort of cohort as Lara, but one of the things that really strikes me, I mean, he does a phenomenal job, so this speaks for himself, but one of the things that I think he touches on is the fact, sort of the opposition side, that this is soft, that this is easy, people are going to fake it through it, and this is just a big benefit for the defendants. And what I can tell you, I think Bobby does a better job at saying that, but as much as this is healing and powerful and transformational, it's also hard. It's not easy, and I'll let him speak to that and explain it a little bit better. Let's see if we can get this to work here, actually.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Robert Fitzpatrick. My crime was distribution and importing drugs. I had been, just to give you a little background on myself, I struggled my whole life with crime and drugs. It had been, to lack of a better way to put it, a family trait. My grandfather, my father, myself, it had just haunted the men in my family forever. And I was, like I said, I was arrested in October of 2015, and I went into the pretrial part of the program and continued to do the same things I did when I was free. Drugs, stupid things, crimes, everything. And it was just repeating itself. And finally, that March, I failed another urine, and they put me into jail, and then Gosnell, which is a treatment facility down in the Cape in Massachusetts. And after a 90-day stay, 75-day stay, I was clean, and I came home. And when I came home, I was still very much just isolating and just blinders on, not realizing anything that I had did, taking any accountability for anything I did. Still didn't even think I committed a crime. You know what I mean? I was just doing what I had to do. I just did what I did. And this opportunity came about the time I was supposed to be sentenced in October, about a year later. So it was October of 2016. I was 15. I don't want to mess you with the dates, but I entered the RISE program with a lot of skepticism. I didn't know nothing about it. My lawyer and I discussed it, and I didn't want to go to jail, and there was no guarantee I wouldn't, but at least it was going to put it off for a year. And I was sober, and I wasn't really doing anything better. I was going to my meetings, and I was staying sober and clean and working, but nothing had really changed with me. Everything was still the same. And that all changed. It all changed when I entered this program. It changed when I sat in Judge Kelly's courtroom for the first time and was taken back by everything that was going on around me. And that was the start of it. But the real change happened at the first Circle 2-day workshop of the restorative part of that. I was completely blown away. I fancied myself as a tough guy, a criminal in Boston or whatever. And I was blown away by the things that I did and the people that I really did affect. I didn't think drug dealing or whatever was really a crime. They were choosing to do it on their own. You know what I mean? And I was a drug addict, so it just all kind of fit together. But when I went there with those 8 people and saw the effect that it had on people like Mahogany and this woman, Janet Connors, who lost her son as part of the drug game, quote unquote, harmless crime, something changed. It made me see things from a different side, that for 40 years and watching my father and grandfather do their thing, and I was like, I thought being like them was cool to some extent. That's how friggin' misguided I was and stupid I was. And that changed, and that was the thing that kick-started and changed a cycle of my family's life. And the things that I learned on that day stick with me today as I sit here before you. I've gone back on those things in the meeting I have. And when I first started that, I was skeptical of that too, because there was probation officers and U.S. attorneys, and I'm like, what's going on here? I'm like, but as we broke it down and we broke into these small groups, we broke each other down. And it was the most powerful thing I've ever been involved in my life. And I look back on that day and that time as the start of the new me. And the things that happened after that were truly life-changing and life-altering to me. I had been at best an absentee father my whole life. I had a son, 14, but I paid child support and I thought that was being a father. But through my steps of getting better and learning to admit what I was and admit who I was and what I really was, I became reconnected with my son. And after a certain period of time of trust on both ways, because of certain things, he was heading down the path that I had followed in my family. And because of the strong support system that I started through this program and the people I met in it and my family, he came to live with me. And together we worked through all the things that we were both struggling with. And today I'm a single father by myself. He lives with me. I have sole custody. He's about to graduate from high school and move on to college next year. And I'm really going to Mass Maritime. It's a little bit, he needs a little bit discipline, a little bit more discipline. So I'm really excited for that. And I just, honestly, I sometimes I go a little bit overboard when I would go see Judge Kelly every month for a status report. But those status reports meant so much to me because I never wanted to go in there and let anybody down. Because when I went to that restorative workshop, I had a bond with these people. And nobody in that group wanted to be the one to let it down. We didn't want to let Judge Kelly down, Maria, anybody in that group, our peers. And it really set that thing every month to go in there was a goal for me to shoot forward to. And I always looked forward to those times. I wasn't always on time, but I always looked forward to that time. And after I finished the program, I graduated, and then I moved on, and I was a peer leader at one of the other workshops, and I got to sentencing, and through my work here in this program, I got a year supervised probation, and whatever time served, and I finished that on March 17th of this year, and everything's going great in my life, and I really believe, I know this is crazy, but I owe it all to the start of that workshop, and it's a really powerful thing to see what you do and the way you affect other people. And I'm not saying it's going to work for everybody. Nothing works for everybody, but it certainly worked for me. And I know that a lot of the people in that group are still doing really, really well. And sometimes you just need to look at it from a different perspective. And it's easy to go to jail. It's easy. I mean, I know that's crazy, but it is. You don't have to worry about anything. You just go to jail. And that's it. And it's hard to stand up in front of a room and tell everybody what you did and what you did to them, and see the expression and the hurt and the pain you bring to somebody else. It's really easy to shut the cell door and go to bed. You know what I mean? So I thank you all for having me. Thank you very much.
I just have a question. I'm sorry. Just have a question before. You've been in jail.
So moving on from this gentleman's question, which we're not going to hear, are there questions for the panel that folks have in the room? Yes.
So two questions. Number one, good morning and thank you for this really great and inspiring presentation. Is there any parallel programs understanding is that all of you are involved in the federal system, so would love to see some models of this program on the state level. And secondly, the million-dollar question, how do they pay for it?
So,
As we try to implement these things, hopefully on the state level, you know, always the pushback is gonna be, we can't afford it, or
Right.
it's not in our budget, et cetera. So just curious about.
so in terms of the second question, the way we pay for this, for us, the program doesn't really cost anything because the time, like when we meet to review people, those are all people, government employees, it's just part of their job and they're doing it. When the real work is done in the RISE program in 3 ways. Judge Kelly, who's a magistrate judge, runs a session every month where people come in. It's a court session, so she's there, but she just fits it into what she's doing. There's the various treatment programs. So we're blessed in the federal system. We have enough money in our probation budget to send Bobby Fitzpatrick to the inpatient treatment program. That's not an expense of the RISE program. We had the ability to do that whether we have RISE or not. So we have some of it is we sometimes send people to other programs for various services in the world, and then Maria essentially mostly does all of this on top of her regular caseload. So it's cobbled together. One of the ways we're trying to expand is Jamie, one of his colleagues in his attorney's office, and a criminal defense attorney who's the chair of our CJA board, which is the private lawyers who take cases, are essentially being trained. They all have familiarity and interest in RJ, and they're being trained by Maria so that now we'll be able to have more cohorts, more of those workshops, and Maria won't have to do them all. So they'll be able to, Jamie's already done one, the other 2 are slated to do one this month and one in February, and then we're creating extra resources. So part that's the U.S. Attorney's Office willing to allow Jamie and his colleague to do that as part of their duties. In terms of, so that's one way to do it. In terms of the state systems that we're doing it, I know of the following things. I don't know where you are, but there's a judge in Michigan, Tim Connors, who's running RJ programs there. There's a program here in DC that I mentioned, juvenile court program. There's a woman in Brooklyn called Danielle Serrato with the DA's office there, runs a restorative justice program. She wrote a book that's excellent called Until We Reckon. In Chicago, I think there's a couple programs. I'm sure there's a lot of programs in prison. There may be others. My sort of plea to you and to everybody else will be this. Don't leave this room and say, wow, that was really interesting. It's cool. It's amazing they do, but I don't have the money. I don't have the authority. I can't do it. I don't know how to do it. You can do this in a variety. You can take these principles and these values and you can do them the way we're doing it. You can do it in a variety. You can do it in an individual case. You can do it in a variety of ways, but you should leave here and say, I'm going to do this and I can. And you in some form or another, in some small or large degree. And I'm happy to talk about it afterwards if you want.
Yes.
Hi, Barbara Creel. Thank you, Lara Bazelon and Ms. Santana and the federal program for bringing this to the national attention. I think it's really important. Restorative justice is powerful and it does require a lot of work. And I especially commend Ms. Santana for sharing your story.
Thank you.
I know that's hard too. And you inspire people. You've inspired me. I'm Native American. I'm a former federal public defender, so I come from the federal system, but my comment is about being Native. These are indigenous principles.
Yes.
This is a Native wisdom and a way of thinking. And I think that the only thing that I would say is it is so powerful, but I'd ask that in bringing this together that we acknowledge Native Americans are overrepresented in the state and federal system, and where they are seen as defendants in the criminal justice system, but they're not seen as thinkers and innovators. In the 1880s, there was a case called Crow Dog where the Major Crimes Act was actually passed to quell and quash this exact restorative justice system happening in Native tribes. In the 1880s, the courts of Indian offenses were created to criminalize Indians for being Indian and to stop doing restorative justice. So the civilized way was to incarcerate. And so it's so ironic that now the civilized way is to think about transforming justice. And what I would ask my question, is there a role for you in talking about this to remove the invisibility of Native and the roots of this really powerful thinking as healing as justice, to bring that back in and just at least acknowledge and name it as an Indigenous principle?
Yes,
And
I think you're
that
right.
would restore dignity
I think
to the
two ways.
whole-
I think one, we should,
era.
you're right, it is, and we should acknowledge that. And the second is, I didn't know that about the Major Crimes Act, but I'm gonna, maybe you have some more information about it, but I'd be very curious about that because I think that would be something, that circle, if you will, would be a really interesting and powerful thing to present as well.
Thank you very much for bringing that up. I apologize. I was remiss. It's usually part of my beginning spiel, but absolutely, these are Native American principles. I was gifted these by the Tagish Tlingit population in Canada. That was the original group that I learned these principles from, and they gave me permission, and we, to be able to replicate these and use them in the system. And I will tell you that in all of our workshops, we acknowledge and we appreciate where these traditions come from. We name it in the manual. It's at the very beginning of our manual that we're creating. So at least I can say I'm very aware that we're blessed that we received permission to use these, we're taught these from the Native American population. Absolutely. This is nothing, and I say this often, this is nothing new. I didn't create this. No one, so there's lots of people that name, I'm the father of Restorative. This is not new. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before us, people have been doing this. The Native population has been doing this work in different ways, and these are just ways that we're trying to sort of return to this. So thank you very much, and I apologize.
Can I just add to that, also apologizing for that, but and that's true in both the federal and the state programs that we do. We will acknowledge at the beginning of it that these are Native American practices, and even to the point where we use a centerpiece, we consider it to be a sacred space. People put in something of value to them as part of the check-in round for it. So it is the derivation for all this. And in fact, all of the, quote unquote, restorative justice practitioners who really got this started in this country will also acknowledge that. People like Howard Zare, they're all saying, we didn't invent this, we got it from indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Raz. I know sentencing is still within the confines of the Constitution, but on a practical level, how does the defendant's participation in RISE affect their ultimate sentence? And how, as a judge, do you see if progress is actually genuine and not an attempt to get a reduced sentence?
Sure. So, well, first, it's always hard to evaluate. It's very hard to sit in judgment of another human being, period. And to know whether when they're saying something to you, whether they're just saying what they think you want to hear or whether it's real. So one of the things about RISE is that it's not a moment in time. It's not just the defendant showing up in front of you and saying, Judge, I've reformed, I've done this, I've done that, I believe this, I accept responsibility. You have a year of conduct to look and see. And what they've done, not so much in terms of what happened in the circle, because I actually don't hear about that. And the defendant could choose to volunteer like he learned, like Bobby did, or Laura did. But in terms of how that affected their life, and that I have that performance. So that's really how you tell. And the John I mentioned, when he came before me, he didn't just say, the reason his mother-in-law was cautiously optimistic was he was sober, and he was working, and he was behaving in different ways, big and small, in all parts of his life. And so that was one of the reasons her letter was significant to me, was that was a form of corroboration. It wasn't just him coming into the sentencing and saying a bunch of words. So that's one way to look at it. I think in terms of what part of your question is, well, what's the value? Well, how does this play out in sentencing? And I think what it plays out in sentencing is that if someone, I give people this analogy. If somebody, there are two people, they're identical. They have the same life history, the same everything. They both committed the same crime with the same amount of money or drugs or whatever, the same amount of harm, exactly the same way. One of them was arrested and said, pardon my language, we said to the arresting officers, fuck you, I didn't do anything wrong. you can't, I'm gonna go out and do this again. And that was the person's attitude all the way through the system. And so I'm pleading guilty only because like, I'm not gonna waste my time coming to court every day for your sham trial. And the other person responded the way Laura responded, or Bobby responded, okay? Who thinks they should be sentenced exactly the same way? Nobody, right? There isn't anybody who thinks they should be treated the same way. They're not the same anymore. And so and the reason they're not the same in part is because that second person has acknowledged that there are rules that they should comply with, and they are accepting responsibility for it, and they're wanting to change, and they are changing. And how you weigh that and how much value to give it in the sentencing depends. It depends on what the crime is. It depends on how much they've done it. It depends on a lot of things, but it matters. It mattered. It always has mattered.
Yes. Gloria. I just want to hear in your description that there also is an assessment of like vocational training and education. That's a big piece of it, is being able to, you know, be self-sustaining and find meaningful, purposeful work. How do you work that into your program?
So I think, as the judge mentioned, we're fortunate on the federal level. We have a little bit more resource than the state level. We do have access to lots of different types of programming. So we collaborate with lots of local vocational training programs, educational programs. And so as part of the program, but frankly, as part of being on federal supervision, you have access to those programs regardless. In the RISE program, the supervision is more intense. So you're working more closely with the probation officer. But on the federal level, if folks are interested and want to, then we can pretty easily hook them up with some sort of training and vocational program. Does that?
Would that be possible to bring this idea to those who will be able to make decisions in the state, at the state level? I mean, the legislative people, the Congress, when they give this idea, because it would be for the state's interest as well, to see the crime rate goes down, and then some of the area, because of that, the economic can develop.
I think, in fact, you're right, but I think it is coming. I think, Jay, in Massachusetts, wasn't there a law passed that about the state, in the state system with respect to restorative justice?
Yes, there's a statewide statute that allows for it to be used both pre-judicial both post-judicial. But one of the things, I gotta be candid, that I think singularizes this project, your project, is that you're in the deep end. I mean, one of my critiques of restorative justice is that historically it's been used for so-called non-serious offenses, and that's always creates the problem with net widening, because a lot of people should be diverted without any type of engagement. Where your program is really, really exciting is you're dealing with serious felonies.
I think that's a really good point. And also, it's interesting to, and I realize there hasn't been as much coverage about criminal justice in the presidential election because we have so much else going on. But if you look at a lot of the candidates' criminal justice platforms who are running for the Democratic nomination, many of them actually have restorative justice components. So I think it is spreading to the point where people who consider themselves to be agents of change and on the more progressive side of criminal justice are embracing it more. But Tina, I wanted to give you a
Yeah, I had a question sort of about the sort of collateral consequences. So in your program and in others, unless there is a moment in which the conviction plea can be sort of either dismissed, be sealed, expunged in some way, the consequences, even with fantastic vocational programs, are a barrier to full entry. Yes, I cannot vote. I cannot work. My housing. So what does your, if anything, do you anticipate sort of getting to a point where that would be part of it, so that people who have taken the
there are a couple,
like, how do we do that?
sure. Couple things I'd say about that. First, it's actually part of our program in a sense that when we created the program, the governing document memo, which although only issued from the court, was a result of conversations with the federal defender and the U.S. attorney. And one of the things is we promised people that we'll consider the good and the bad, whatever they did at sentencing. But what the government said and agreed to was that in an appropriate case, in their sole discretion, they would consider whether to either reduce the charge, or even though there'd been a plea, reduce the charge or dismiss the charges and vacate it. Our program, RISE, there are a lot of, there are probably 20 or 25 districts in the federal system with programs similar to RISE in various ways, and we were not the first. And much of what, in general, in that program, we borrowed from those. I know in the Eastern District of New York, which is the pioneer in that, the U.S. Attorney's Office has done that. What is unique to our program is the restorative justice part. And what is particularly unique that as a result that I'm certainly an advocate for, is that we should be doing more restorative justice in a variety of different ways, at a variety of places in the system. So it's part of it in the sense that the government could choose to do that. I don't think they've chosen to do it in any of the cases yet, and it's up to them. So it wouldn't be something that I would be like talking to them about particularly. But that kind of judgment, like should it be a diversion or should you not have a conviction or vacate a conviction or what have you, is a larger, that implicates that's not just up to the court.
Although I will say, Tina, in Kings County, the partnership that the judge was referencing, or maybe you know about it already, but just that it's sort of amazing that these are very, very serious crimes. Murder, attempted murder, maiming, shooting, stabbings, and when they go through that process, they don't end up with a conviction. The victims, it's very victim-centered in this program, and it's cooperative with the DA's office, and I imagine there's some kind of funneling mechanism through Gonzalez's office about who gets in, but they're serious, and this program's been around for 10 years?
Yeah, and it actually, as to the net widening, it is actually only for violent crime.
Yeah. Which is so interesting.
Which is really interesting, and the sort of takeaway is that there would be a period of time after the session and after sort of
the agreement's reached.
The agreement is reached, thank you for that language, that there'd also be a period of time potentially on probation, and then the district attorney's office will entertain a motion to dismiss, so that the sort of future of this person has been now fully made whole.
Right.
And
that sort of answers.
In the Bronx as well now.
Wow. In the Bronx
too.
In
the Bronx as well.
That's so good. Yeah. And there was a program in place. This is going to sound maybe wild to some people, but in Pima County, Arizona, and it was specifically for sex offenders. And so it was felonies and misdemeanors. It was a range of conduct. Again, there was a funneling function from the Pima County Prosecutor's Office, but the people who went through that program and successfully completed it, and it was an RJ-based program, did not end up with any kind of sex offense conviction. It was federally funded, and the funding dried up and it wasn't renewed, which I think is unfortunate, because I think that's another area where it could have a positive effect.
I think one thing, apropos, Tina, of your question, would be that I've only read the book. I'm more familiar with the program in Brooklyn a lot. I'm very interested in it. But I think from reading it that the victims feel very empowered.
Yeah.
And because they feel empowered, that is part of the reason they choose it and they are happy with it. And one of their dissatisfactions with the traditional system is they don't feel empowered. And though I think the way that you can reach the results, both in terms of positive outcomes that they have and that there aren't these collateral consequences you described, is because the victims are empowered.
Yeah.
Could I just add to that just briefly? Just from the prosecutor's standpoint, I think, Tina, it's a great point. Prosecutors, in my experience, don't tend to think as much about collateral consequences at all. We actually have in the audience Professor Jenny Roberts, who literally wrote the book on collateral consequences. She's educated me a little bit to pay a little more attention to that. But it's a key issue, and we're not making it easy for people who are coming out in terms of reentry.
The last thing that I would just like to say is that I'm not an expert in this, but I am happy to collaborate, provide our experience. If folks are interested in developing or looking at a program or some sort of more structured way to do this in your sort of realm, I'm happy to do that. I will make Judge Sorokin go.
I'm happy to do it.
And Jamie, and we welcome folks to come. We welcome folks to come visit us. So the invitation for everyone is there.
Any other words of question? Yeah.
I'm the senior co-chair of the Alternative Dispute and Committee in this same area of restorative justice. And I had a unique experience of serving in both a federal and state court, the Superior Court of D.C., where the U.S. Attorney is the prosecutor, but we also have general jurisdiction on state-type cases. And one of the things that I pioneered in the 17 years that I served on that court was a barring in probation cases, review proceedings, much like you do in election abuse and family law cases, and to make sure the agencies, government, probation officers were providing the services they needed and participating in programs like this. And I reflected since I retired, and in 17 years, I had not a single probation violation as a result of using these techniques. And I just wanted to volunteer that. But Superior Court of DC is somewhat unique in the sense that we are presidential appointees and exercise federal jurisdiction as well as state jurisdiction.
That's great. Thank you. So thank you all so much for coming. I want everyone to feel free to come up and ask us any questions that you have. We're around and we would love to talk to any and all of you. And we're just so appreciative of you coming and being open to hearing about this program because it's just so amazing. And I want to thank Judge Sorokin and Maria and Jamie and Laura for coming all the way from Boston to be with us today. So thank you so much.